Charles Evans boarded the bus leaning on his cane. Unfortunately, it wasn't as easy and graceful as he would have liked. His back pain was becoming increasingly frequent and had turned the elderly man's life into sheer agony. In his younger years, Charles had taken part in armed conflict in the jungles of Indochina. As a memento of those times, the veteran got the Purple Heart Medal, as well as a lower back injury that grew more pronounced with each passing year. Having entered the bus, Charles paid the fare and decided to take an empty seat by the window. At that moment, the shoelace of his shoe came undone, causing him to stumble and nearly fall into the aisle. Mr. Evans winced, but he couldn't change the situation. The pain in his lower back prevented him from bending over, so he had to pretend that nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Mr. Evans had long grown accustomed to the fact that the consequences of his injury hindered his daily life. However, there was no point in dwelling on the past, as it couldn't be changed. As he looked at the untied shoelace, Charles shook his head and closed his eyes warily. At that moment, he was unaware that a lovely young woman was observing him attentively. The stranger was seated opposite the elderly veteran and immediately noticed the untied shoelace on his shoe. Seizing the moment when the bus stopped at a traffic light, the woman approached Mr. Evans. She kneeled right down before him and quickly tied his shoelaces. The elderly man's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "You shouldn't have done that. I could have managed on my own, even if not so easily as you." The stranger smiled in response and replied with a barely noticeable Eastern accent. "No need to thank me, sir. Anyone would have done the same thing in my place." Mr. Evans looked at the woman with undisguised respect and felt a sense of pride that such kind people lived in this city. Since he had a few more stops to go, he asked the woman a couple of unobtrusive questions. As the conversation revealed, the woman's name was Amina. She had recently moved to the United States with her fiancé and had yet fully adapted to her new life. Amina came from one of the countries in the Middle East and dreamed of a life in New York, which was always the city of her dreams. Mr. Evans nodded understandingly. He knew that it was always challenging for newcomers to adapt to life in the metropolis, especially if they grew up in another country. When the bus approached Mr. Evans' stop, he attempted to get up too abruptly, causing him to groan from the pain in his back. "Let me help you. Here, take my hand." "That's it, slowly," Amina commanded. Tears welled up in the eyes of the elderly man. Meanwhile, Amina helped the old man get off the bus, not forgetting his small bag with the modest assortment of groceries. "But what about you? This isn't your stop, is it?" Mr. Evans asked, somewhat embarrassed. Amina smiled. "Don't worry, I'll take a little walk and help you in the meantime. I only need to go 2 stops further. I'm looking for a job." Mr. Evans perked up. "Are you having problems with that? Maybe there's something I can help with." Amina looked at her elderly companion and then replied, "I don't think you can help me, sir. The thing is, my fiancé got injured while working at the construction site, so he's undergoing treatment right now, and the doctors say it will take him over a month to recover. And no one wants to hire me because I'm a foreigner and don't have any experience." Charles started thinking. Amina's story stirred feelings in his heart that he never even knew existed. To be honest, he felt sorry for the young woman who was trying her best to survive in an unfamiliar city. Charles couldn't have children on his own. Medical examinations and treatments had yielded no results. Charles and his wife even thought about adopting a child, but something always got in the way. Mr. Evans smiled and looked at Amina, who was supporting him by the elbow, firmly decided to help the young woman. As they were passing by a fast food restaurant, the elderly veteran stopped and asked his companion to wait for him at the entrance. He opened the door and found himself in a comfortably air-conditioned room filled with the pleasant aroma of various spices and food additives. Shuffling the soles of his worn-out shoes, the old man passed through the dining area and arrived at the door marked Manager. Charles hesitated for a moment and then knocked 3 times. Having heard the loud "come in," he turned the doorknob. The manager's office was cozy. There was soft music playing, and for a moment there, Charles felt like he was at home. Looking at the elderly man seated at the table, Mr. Evans said, "I'm glad to see you again, Master Sergeant." The manager tore his gaze away from the papers on the table and smiled at his guest. "Charles, is that really you? How many years has it been, man? 3, 5? Did you completely forget about me? Remember how tough it was in the Mekong Valley?" Mr. Evans nodded, indicating to his former brother-in-arms that he had come for a specific reason. "You've known me for many years, John. I rarely ask you for any favors, but now I need your help." Charles began. "What can I do for you, Corporal?" John Simpson asked with interest. Charles approached the table and leaned over to the veteran sitting there. He quickly explained the essence of the matter. By the way the manager's face changed, it was clear that Charles's proposal had struck a chord with him. In conclusion, Mr. Evans added, "I take full responsibility and personally vouch for this woman." "All right, Charles, tell her to come in. I'll be happy to help you and your friend," John Simpson, the former master sergeant, replied. When Mr. Evans left the cafe, Amina was waiting for him at the entrance, looking somewhat bored. Little did she know that just a few minutes ago, this elderly man had solved her employment issue. "Well, Amina, I think congratulations are in order. I got you a job as a waitress in this cafe, and its owner is my old army buddy, with whom we went through thick and thin in the jungles of Indochina," Charles said, shaking the woman's hands. Amina's face literally lit up with happiness. Mrs. Evans's gesture touched her deeply. After thanking the veteran for his help, Amina assisted him in getting home and then hurried back to the cafe. Mr. Evans stood on the porch of his home for a long time, watching the woman leave. His gaze seemed distant, as if he were contemplating something related to his past. Several years passed, during which Charles Evans didn't see Amina again. With each passing year, it became increasingly difficult for the elderly man to venture into the city, so he relied more and more on home deliveries of groceries and medications. But it wasn't just this that sourced Mr. Evans's life. His beloved wife, Charlotte, fell seriously ill. The situation was very complicated because she hadn't sought medical attention in time, significantly worsening her condition. Only after Charlotte underwent a complete medical checkup did the doctors diagnose her with a severe illness. It was by no means a death sentence, but given her advanced age, there was a risk that Mrs. Evans might not withstand the surgery. 75 years. At such an age, the strain on the body was particularly high. Charlotte had long come to terms with the bleak verdict of the doctors and didn't want to dwell in it. But Charles continued to search for a solution to their predicament with unwavering determination. He knew that the cost of the operation was substantial, and gathering the necessary funds was far from simple. Desperate, Mr. Evans decided to take out a loan from a bank, if they would approve it, of course. The elderly veteran simply had no other choice, especially since his military background taught him to always fight to the end. However, Mr. Evans had barely walked 100 yards from his home when an expensive SUV pulled up next to him. He looked at the car warily and continued on his way, leaning on his walking stick. But when the door of the Ford swung open and a familiar voice called out to him, his heart swelled with joy. The owners of the SUV turned out to be Amina and her husband, Yusuf. In the intervening years, they had done significant work and managed to change their lives for the better. Despite Amina's significantly elevated social status, she remained the same kind and compassionate woman. Upon learning of Mr. Evans's problem, she immediately offered to help. "But that's a lot of money, and I'm not sure when I'll be able to repay you," the elderly veteran began hesitantly. "Don't worry, sir. You don't have to pay us back at all. You've done so much for both Amina and me that we owe you everything we have," Yusuf replied. Tears welled up in Mr. Evans's eyes. He stood there and still couldn't believe everything that just happened. Only when Amina and Yusuf transferred the money to the hospital's account did he realize that it was all real. Needless to say, Charlotte was extremely anxious on the day of the surgery. Fortunately, thanks to the professionalism of the doctors and state-of-the-art equipment, everything went well. Only now, when his wife was undergoing a lengthy rehabilitation course at one of the country's seaside resorts, did Charles finally breathe a sigh of relief. But most importantly, Amina and Yusuf started visiting the elderly couple almost every week. And they didn't come alone, but with their 2 young sons, allowing Charlotte and Charles to feel like real grandparents. Watching the joyful faces of their little boys, Amina and Yusuf were confident that they enjoyed the company of the elderly couple, whose hearts responded to them with genuine kindness and warmth.